This is Sinister Grave, and I have a very important shout out to give. This one goes out to Aries. She's a very talented YouTuber, and if you like creepy horror content, I highly suggest you take a gander at her channel. Now, without further ado, sit back, relax, and let this nightmare unfold. In the early 70s, my Aunt Sarah studied at a college in a very conservative small town. Sarah lived on a campus while her boyfriend Jack, who eventually became my uncle, lived in a crappy house in a crappy part of town off campus. Because the college was in an industrial town, they were surrounded by big feedlots and beef packaging plants. Basically, they were slaughterhouses. They ran 24 hours a day, and among the blue-collar workforce, there were many undocumented workers that were paid under the table and lived off the grid. Part of my aunt's coursework for her degree was going to the local district and trying to help illegal immigrant families get resources for their kids. Mostly the work was depressing as fuck. The families wanted the resources, but they didn't want to have any attention brought to them because of their undocumented status. It was just a complete disaster. Now, Uncle Jack lived across the street from a crappy apartment building that housed several of these families, and often groups of children would be playing outside. One day, while visiting, my aunt noticed this kid, a 5 or 6-year-old little girl, sitting alone in the apartment's crumbling balcony. After that, whenever she'd visit during the week, day or night, the girl would be there, but she was always gone on the weekends. There were a lot of people who lived in those units, so on the weekends there would be tons of kids of all ages running around, tearing crap up. Generally being little jerks, like kids do. They moved into the house in August, so it was blazing hot, and the sun did not set until almost 10 at night, so the kids were always running around. Any given weekday, though, that kid would be sitting there all by herself, just staring over at them well into the evening. My aunt said at first she just thought it was sad that the kid didn't have anyone really looking after her. But then it started turning to fall, and the days were getting shorter and colder. One night, my uncle was walking my aunt out to her car, and she remarked to him that little girl wasn't out there. A relief, really, because it was getting so cold. But then a car turned down the street with its brights on. And when the headlights hit the balcony of that apartment building, the kid was still there. My aunt said she must have been wearing black clothes because when the high beams passed over her, all she could really see was this very pale little face. The headlights were washing all of her features away. She had been there the entire time. They just hadn't seen her because it was so dark. That was the turning point for my aunt. By now, she was into her internship with the district, and she was doing a lot of outreach. So one weekend afternoon, when it was still pretty nice outside, she and my uncle approached the families mingling outside. She asked about the little girl, but no one would talk to her. She said even the kids pretended not to be able to understand her. When winter came, Still, the little girl would be seen on the balcony, appearing like she wasn't wearing a coat. At this point, my aunt decided to stage an intervention to get the kid a jacket and maybe even enroll her into schools. So she sees the kid one morning and heads across the street. She then headed up the stairs that led to the second level. But by the time she got there, the kid was gone. My aunt didn't hear any footsteps. She didn't hear any doors closing. Nothing. My aunt figures it's the same thing from before. They're just scared from an outsider. But now she's more determined than ever because this kid clearly needs some resources. And that week it snowed, so when the weekend comes, a bunch of the little jackals that were living across the street were outside stockpiling snowballs to throw at each other. My aunt has learned from that last time. So this time she doesn't take my uncle. She only takes candy and a bunch of silver dollars. The older kids avoid her like the plague, but a couple of the little ones come over and my aunt starts asking about the little girl. The kids were way more interested in candy and silver dollars than the questions, and most of them refuse to answer until one of them finally says, Venka, the name of the child. She never heard of a name like that, but she gives the little kids candy and money. Anyway, which eventually entices the older kids to come talk to her until she asks about Venka. Then the older kids completely clam up, gathering all the little ones in like 30 seconds, and then everyone was gone. One winter evening when it was hella dark, my aunt saw the kid. By now, it was absolutely freezing out, and there had been an ice storm the night before, and that kid was still out there. Flipping out, my aunt headed over, fully intending to get the kid and call the cops because it wasn't just neglect at this point. It was abuse. When she finally made it up the apartment's building's icy stairs, the kid was once again gone, which finally got my aunt to freak out because there was no way a kid could have moved that fast on icy concrete. And she knows that none of the doors to any of the apartments were open. Still, she pulled it together and decided to walk the length of the balcony just to make sure the kid wasn't there. Reaching the midway point where this kid was always sitting, she saw deep in the ice she didn't know what to call them. I guess these footprints, because they weren't really shaped like feet, not even little feet. And they weren't just on the top of the ice. They were all the way through it, down into the bare concrete. It was like the kid had been standing there during the ice storm the previous night, and the ice had built up around her feet. Terrified, my aunt tore her ass off the balcony and down the stairs, managing to trip and taking a spectacular chunk out of her shin. And she still has that scar today. After making it to my uncle's house and saying what happened, he and two of his roommates headed over to check it out while she stayed back and had someone patching her leg up. After about 10 minutes, the guys came back and told her that they saw the footprints. Though none of them could come up with any type of explanation, they tried to play it off with all these different scenarios that may seem plausible. Like maybe there had been some empty cups or something sitting there and the kid kicked them off the ledge, and that was what made the weird footprints. They convinced her that if they went over and looked at it in the morning, they would probably find some cups on the ground. And that maybe my aunt didn't see anyone at all. Probably a shadow that looked like a child. But none of that made sense. After winter finals, my uncle and his roommates decided to throw a giant kegger before everyone headed home for Christmas. It was the first time my aunt had been back in the house since all of the balcony stuff had happened. But everything now seemed fine. The little girl was nowhere to be seen. The party ended up being low-key, but with only my uncle and his roommates and their girlfriends and one roommate's sister, Marisol, in attendance, the night wore on, and another ice storm began outside, causing the power to go out and the roommates to light a fire in the fireplace. They were all fairly trashed at this point, and one of the roommates brought up the weird footprints, something they'd yet speak about out loud. Finally, around the fire, my uncle and two of his roommates admitted that it was creepy as fuck. "I know it's not possible, but it looked like," began one of the guys. "A goat hoof or a pig hoof," filled in the other roommate, leaving my uncle to remark, "Yeah, like something was standing there with cloven feet." The entire energy of the room was uneasy, according to my aunt, and one of the roommates asked, "What's the name of that girl again? Was it Velma?" "Venka," my aunt corrected. My aunt says you could have heard a pin drop at this point, but eventually someone changed the subject, and everyone continued to drink and goof around. At some point, however, my aunt went into the kitchen and was followed by Marisol, the roommate's sister. Alone in the kitchen, Marisol, a weird expression on her face, asked, "Did you say the girl's name was Venka?" And my aunt nodded, telling her that it was that kid across the street from her on the balcony. Marisol nodded and didn't say anything for a while, but when my aunt turned away to leave, Marisol put a hand on her arm and said, "It wasn't Venka. It was Venga. It's slang. It means come here in Spanish." And that's when Marisol told my aunt the story. It was the first year the district and the college tried the internship my aunt was participating in. And Marisol, participating in the program, was literally stuck going door to door trying to find the families with kids that needed to be enrolled. She got a hell of a lot farther than my aunt ever got because she spoke fluent Spanish. The family still didn't like her nosing around, but they would at least speak to her. Marisol said she went to another crappy apartment building, not across the street from my uncle's rental, but close. While there, she saw all of these kids, including a little girl dressed in dark clothes, who appeared to be by herself. So Marisol talked to the more friendly kids and their families, convincing them that they could qualify for the services and go to school, and that it's a really good thing to be doing. Getting up to go, she asked about the little girl she saw outside. Upon mentioning her, an older woman, probably a grandmother or great-grandmother, crossed herself and shook her head. She told Marisol that what she saw that night wasn't a little girl. It was a bad spirit, and Marisol should forget she ever saw her.